Right. So imagine being invited to dinner in London, 1833. A respectable house, respectable guests, wine, conversation, and a coffin. Yes, you heard me right, a coffin. Inside it lies an Egyptian mummy, wrapped in linen for thousands of years, prepared for eternity by people who believed the dead should remain undisturbed. Tonight, however, the dead are going to be unwrapped. In a drawing room, like a gift in a mystery box, while the guests watch. And the man doing the unwrapping is not an archaeologist. He is a surgeon. His name is Thomas Joseph Pettigrew. London would eventually give him a rather unusual nickname, Mummy Pettigrew. But before we meet him, we need to understand something. London was already in love with Egypt, and like most Victorian love affairs, it was becoming slightly excessive. Few ancient civilizations have captivated imaginations quite like Egypt. In the 19th century, this fascination peaked with a craze known as Egyptomania in the United Kingdom and United States, permeating architecture, fashion, and popular culture. For a while, Egypt seemed to be everywhere. On buildings, in paintings, in books, in furniture, in jewellery, and in the curious little objects that wealthy people collected to make their homes look as though they had been decorated by someone who had just returned from the Nile. Egypt was mysterious, ancient, distant, and, most importantly, fashionable. Egyptomania became a mass rather than a niche concern in the wake of Napoleon Bonaparte's dramatic invasion of Egypt in 1798. Bonaparte famously brought antiquaries and other scholars with him to Egypt, where they scoured the country for artefacts, collecting items such as the Rosetta Stone. Over the next 2 decades, English and French consuls in Egypt unscrupulously recruited people to seize as many antiquities as they could, which now form many of the collections in the British Museum, Louvre, and Egyptian Museum of Turin. London already had its Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly, an extraordinary building designed in an Egyptian style and opened in 1812. Inside you could see exhibitions, curiosities and spectacles. Victorians also had a paint colour known as mummy brown or Egyptian brown, which contained ground-up mummy. The colour came from a dark resin-like substance called bitumen, believed to have been used in the embalming process. It very quickly became a black market trade, so that you had just as much likelihood of getting mummy brown paint that was actually made with mummy versus not. Perhaps the most unusual use for mummies in the Victorian era was grinding them into a powder for a medicine called mumia. Mumia had been part of the apothecary trade since the Middle Ages, and many scholars of the time described it as a great medical cure for all kinds of things. But this subject is for future episodes. For now, Victorians were especially interested in mummies. In ancient Egypt, the practice of mummification was a sacred ritual in which embalmed bodies were wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen to preserve the deceased for the afterlife. You could collect Egyptian curiosities, admire Egyptian architecture, and you could decorate with Egyptian designs, something you could display and talk about at dinner. And perhaps that was inevitable. The Victorians had a particular talent for turning fascination into furniture. They did it with almost everything. If they admired something, they put it in the parlour. And Egypt was no exception. But there was one part that was considerably harder to turn into tasteful decoration. Death. The Egyptians had left behind something the Victorians found irresistible. Mummies. There was something magical about them. Here was a person who had lived thousands of years ago. Someone who had walked beneath the same sun, spoken, eaten, loved, worried, grown old, and eventually been wrapped in linen and placed inside a tomb. Then time passed. Kingdoms disappeared. Languages changed. Cities became ruins. And somehow, the body remained. To the Victorian imagination, this was irresistible. A mummy was not merely an archaeological object. It was a message from the dead. A human being who had somehow survived the entire history of the world that came after them. And naturally, someone had to unwrap it. Thomas Joseph Pettigrew was born in 1791. He trained as a surgeon and became deeply interested in antiquities and the ancient world, and that combination made him particularly suited to one very unusual occupation: mummy unrolling spectacle. Pettigrew became one of the best-known figures in 19th century Britain, associated with examining Egyptian mummies. And unlike a modern museum curator, he didn't have the luxury of simply looking through glass. If he wanted to know what was inside, he had to open it. Linen had to be removed, layers had to be examined, objects hidden among the wrappings could be studied, the body itself could be inspected. To Pettigrew, this was serious work. He wanted to understand Egyptian embalming. He studied the methods used to preserve the dead. He examined the bodies and recorded his findings. And eventually, he published his research. In 1834, his History of Egyptian Mummies appeared in London. It was no small pamphlet written by an eccentric gentleman fascinated by corpses. It was a substantial work. Pettigrew wanted the subject treated seriously. And yet, there was another side to the mummy business. Because while Pettigrew saw scientific and historical value in the dead, the public saw spectacle. And that difference would make him famous. Imagine you've been invited to a room. Candles, polished furniture, gentlemen in evening clothes, ladies watching from their seats. And in the middle, a mummy, thousands of years old, waiting beneath its linen. The audience had come to see the past revealed, and there was something deeply theatrical about it. Pettigrew works slowly, because beneath all the fascination, there is still a human being. Someone whose name may have been forgotten, someone whose family once knew their voice, someone who expected to remain among the dead, not to become an evening attraction in London. And perhaps this is the moment when the Victorian fantasy becomes slightly darker. The first bandage comes away, then another, and another. The room grows quieter. Perhaps there is an amulet, perhaps a fragment of cloth, perhaps some small object that has remained hidden for centuries. And then, the face. The human face beneath the wrappings. Suddenly the ancient world doesn't seem quite so ancient. It is looking back at you. And that, I suspect, was the most important part of the fascination. The Victorians loved the past, but they loved the moment when the past became visible even more. Pettigrew understood this because he was also a showman, and mummy unwrapping became an event to attend and to talk about afterwards to your friends. When we think about it, there is something beautiful about the Victorian fascination with Egypt. Not because everything they did with Egyptian antiquities was beautiful. Some of it was exploitative, careless, and deeply uncomfortable. But the dream itself of Egypt was extraordinary. Egypt had crossed the Mediterranean, and eventually crossed the threshold of the Victorian drawing room. Pettigrew continued his work for decades. He examined mummies and wrote about them. He collected knowledge about Egyptian funerary practices, and his work helped make the study of mummies a serious field of antiquarian and medical investigation. But his nickname survived: Mummy Pettigrew, a wonderfully Victorian name for a wonderfully Victorian character. A surgeon who spent his life looking backward, a scholar who turned ancient death into modern curiosity. And perhaps the strangest thing about him is that he was not alone. The mummy was only the final expression of something much larger. Victorian London wanted Egypt. It wanted the temples, the hieroglyphs, the pharaohs, the desert, the mystery, and eventually, the dead. They wanted to bring the ancient world into their homes, even if it occasionally arrived wrapped in linen. So the next time you find yourself complaining that modern dinner parties have become predictable, be grateful. At least your host isn't standing beside the fireplace with a 3,000-year-old corpse. Good night, and sleep well, if you can.